So I think that we're beginning to undo the damage that we've done for a long time. And then when cities do remove off-street parking requirements, we can see what happened. I think the example that I like best was in Champaign, Illinois, a student area right next to the campus that they previously required one parking space per apartment for many years, and then they just removed it. The number of parking spaces per apartment fell from 1.05. The minimum was 1, and they provided 1.05 because it's sometimes easier if there's a parking lot, you can't get exactly one space per apartment, but it went down to 0.31. That's a 70% decrease. Well, what was the number of parking spaces per acre? This is per acre of the parcel, and it fell by parking spaces fell by 70%. And the number of parking spaces per acre fell by 48%, and the apartments per acre rose by 79%. So apartments replaced parking spaces, and people replaced cars simply because you let it happen. Nothing was encouraged. It just says you could do what you want with parking, and it led to a lot more housing.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Active Towns channel. My name is John Zimmerman, and that is Professor Donald Shoup, the Shoup Dogg, Professor Emeritus at UCLA and the author of The High Cost of Free Parking. We are touching base with Don to see what he has been up to and nerding out on parking reform and really reflecting on the last 4 years or so of amazing things that have happened in the area of parking reform. Before we dive into this episode, I just want to remind everybody, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. It's easy to do. Just click on the link activetowns.org and navigate up to the support tab at the top of the page. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. And let's get right to it with Donald Shoup. Professor Donald Shoup, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Active Towns podcast.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Don, I would love to have you just give a really quick introduction for the audience. Who the heck is Donald Shoup?
Well, I'm a retired professor from the University of California in Los Angeles. I was born in Long Beach, but didn't stay very long. I think the most notable thing in my life is that my father was in the Navy, which is why I was born in Long Beach. And his ship was transferred to Honolulu in 1940. So my earliest memory in life was the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so life has been comparatively calm ever since.
That's right. Well, and I used to live in Honolulu. I used to live in Hawaii, but I'm originally from Southern California. I'm originally from Los Angeles. I'm a fourth generation Los Angelino. I think my ancestors, my extended family, they first arrived in the Los Angeles area right around the turn of the century in the 1800s. And so I have deep roots in Los Angeles, and I love Los Angeles. And the fact that you were born in Long Beach is significant because you have a nickname that is tied to another famous person who was born in Long Beach.
Well, the most famous person born in Long Beach is Shoup Dogg. I've piggybacked on him. The students call me Shoup Dogg, and a little less sounding good as they say what I teach is the Shoup dogma. And of course, dogma is not the thing that you want to be attached to. But I think, yes, Shoup Dogg and I were both born in Long Beach.
Yeah,
That has to count for something.
I find it very endearing, and I find the fact that Snoop Dogg has seemed to have really been benefiting from a resurgence in popularity along with the Olympics. I mean, he was all over the screen on the Olympics there in Paris, and of course, as well as the run up for the Olympics that'll be happening in Los Angeles in 2028. And so every time I see him on screen, I think of you as well.
And he is great, except when you read the lyrics, they're a bit a bit too much.
They are a bit too much, and it is funny, and it is quite endearing. And I'm going to pop over to your website here, which, by the way, is Shoup Dogg, and that's two G's .com. And so I love that there is that hat tip to it. And you just mentioned too about the Shoup dogma, and the fact that you don't necessarily want to be attached to the thoughts that you're doing and you're thinking about, don't necessarily wish to be attached to a dogma versus a doctrine. And that's exactly what you bring up and you talk about in this this paper, or this this chapter that you have are working on here. Talk a little bit about that for people who may not be super familiar with the difference between a dogma and a doctrine.
Well, somebody who's dogmatic is somebody who won't listen to anybody else, and they think that whatever they say is true. And just can't be challenged. Whereas a doctrine, which sounds a little bit similar, but it is different. It's it's a well organized way of thinking, but it's open for challenge. That you're almost eager to have it challenged, because I think I've learned a lot from the students who didn't agree with what I was saying, and especially from the far left. But some of the best students were from the far left, and trying to convince them about what I'm saying is very healthy. And I've changed my mind many times. Of course, everybody changes their mind, but I have adapted over. Well, I think the first article that I wrote that had parking in it was in 1970. So I've had to refine what I'm thinking, and I've learned a lot. And I think that yes, a doctrine is something that you work on and try to do the best you can, and provide as much evidence you can. I mean, that's extremely important, of course, is to get evidence. And if the evidence refutes what you had been saying, you have to adapt to what you're saying. So a doctrine is much more flexible and forward-looking, whereas a dogma is dogmatic, and it's unchallengeable.
Yeah, yeah. And I do want to stick with this particular chapter and the upcoming The Shoup Doctrine that is being edited by Daniel Hess with Routledge Publishing. Do we know when this is going to be coming out?
Oh, sometime next year. I don't know where it's. I, Daniel Hess was a former student and is now a professor at the University of Buffalo, and he has arranged for chapters to be written. I think about 33 chapters on the Shoup Doctrine, uh, and I've been able. He asked me to edit them, so I feel it's like editing 33 eulogies of yourself. So I want to get them right.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was wonderful to see this chapter come out, and I thank you very much for sending this ahead to me to be able to read this. It, in many ways, it reads like a very short little synopsis of your classic book, The High Cost of Free Parking. For those who may not be familiar with the book, I do encourage everybody to listen to our first episode from back in season 1. In fact, let's pull that up here, right here on screen. is way back in season 1 on episode 43. You and I talk a little bit more about your early days and, you know, the formation of your career and how you sort of got to this stage of being one of the most are the foremost experts in the area of parking and reimagining parking and the need for parking reforms, which is, you know, what we have here on screen about his 3 foundational parking reform things. And so I'll encourage people to go ahead and listen to that. But talk a little bit about that foundational book that, you know, sort of culminated the early years of your career and that formation of an absolute classic book. It is a lot to digest. It's 750 some odd pages, I think. But it's a delightful book because you're a delightful writer. Talk a little bit about that book and as an introduction to folks who may not be familiar with it.
Well, for a long time, nobody could understand how I could be interested in parking. It seems so pedestrian, and that they just couldn't think that there could be anything important to say about parking. Everybody's done it. I hope all of your listeners and readers are parked now if they have a car. The average car is parked 95% of the time. So I thought that I could divide the field, that everybody else could have the 5% of the time that cars are moving, and I could look at the 95% of the time that cars are parked. I mean, parking is the link between driving and everything else in life. It is extremely important. It's the single biggest user of land in any city. There's more square feet of land for parking than for the footprint of housing or commerce or anything else. And most people park free wherever they go. So what got me interested in this is how could something that be so much of it on such valuable land and it's free to the user. What economists say, there's something wrong there, that people are not paying for what they're using. And how did that happen? Well, I guess I could back up and say, suppose when the car was invented, just near the birth of the car, say 1900, Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller had asked you, how can city planning increase the demand for fuel and cars? So I thought, well, here are 3 things to look at: is that divide the city into zones, housing here, jobs there, shopping someplace else. So there have to be a lot of travel between the zones, and then limit the density of the zones. Have single-family housing and minimum lot size and maximum height limits. And single family housing for most of all housing, to spread the city out and increase the demand for driving. And third, require ample off-street parking everywhere. Well, that would be a terrific benefit for car makers and oil producers.
Yeah, and it was.
Now,
It turned out it was.
that's right. Well, I think planners didn't mean to enrich the car and the oil industry, but our city plans have done that. I think we made a terrific mistake right from the beginning. So for 100 years, we've had this car-centric planning. And it's very hard to think of undoing it. If you think, what if we had not done that? Suppose we had always charged for curb parking at the right price. By the right price of curb parking, I mean the lowest price you could charge, and still have 1 or 2 open spaces on every block. So wherever you drove, you'd always see 1 or 2 open spaces. They wouldn't be free, but it'd be the lowest price the city could charge and still have that result.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you did that at the beginning and you charged the right price for curb parking and spent the revenue on public services on the metered blocks, uh, then I think the world would work a lot better, and we would live a lot better. That we'd never had minimum parking requirements. We'd never said that you can't build a house without two parking spaces, or an apartment building without two parking spaces per apartment. We had left that to the market. That we let prices do the planning for parking, and not city planners having hundreds of land uses, saying that say there are 9 different land uses for adult land uses. Adult bookshops, adult massage parlors, adult theaters, sex novelty shops, and planners have pretended that they know exactly how many parking spaces are needed for every one of those. So maybe planning isn't such an uninteresting profession, but that is for everything. And every time a new land use comes along, like a nail salon, they have to create a parking requirement, say 4 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet for a nail salon, or 2 parking spaces per body piercing artist in a body piercing studio. The planners don't know anything about this. All they know, they have to provide a parking requirement. So we've made terrific mistakes for the past 100 years, and I think we're just beginning to undo those errors. Some cities have removed all their parking requirements, say like San Jose, and that was one of the biggest cities to start removing hundreds of land uses for parking requirements, and they just canceled them. Just think of something that has been added for 40 or 50 years. You keep adding more. It's like barnacles on a ship's hull, that each one slows the ship down and increases the fuel consumption, and you have to have them all scraped off. So I think removing the off-street parking requirements is like scraping the barnacles off of a ship, and it doesn't cost anything. And it saves a lot of time for the planners, because I've heard it from many agencies. They said that over 1/4% of all the time that they have in dealing with development is dealing with the parking requirements. And now some cities, they just don't have any parking requirements anymore. It just, say when Buffalo was the first big city that removed off-street parking requirements, and replaced it with one sentence saying there's no requirement for parking at any land use. So I think that we're beginning to undo the damage that we've done for a long time. And then when cities do remove off-street parking requirements, we can see what happened. I think the example that I like best was in Champaign, Illinois, in a student area right next to the campus, that they previously required one parking space per apartment for many years, and then they just removed it. And they looked at how the two planners on the faculty at the University of Illinois looked at what happened, and the number of apartments. Yes, there you go. The number of parking spaces per apartment fell from 1.05. The minimum was one, and they provided 1.05 because it's sometimes easier if there's a parking lot, you can't get exactly one space per apartment, but it went down to 0.31. That's a 70% decrease. But we went further and looked, well, what was the number of parking spaces per acre? This is per acre of the parcel, and it fell by parking spaces fell by 70%. And the number of parking spaces per acre fell by 48%, and the apartments per acre rose by 79%. So apartments replaced parking spaces, and people replaced cars simply because you let it happen. Nothing was encouraged. It just says you could do what you want with parking, and it led to a lot more housing.
Yeah. Yeah. Now we're staring at this image here. I've been lingering here on this. This is the landing page for your book out on my bookshop. I do have a bookshop associated with activetowns.org and the Active Towns channel. So all of my guests that are here on the podcast, I try to put your books out there. And so we've got the high cost of free parking. You mentioned in the 1970s you started writing about this extensively, and then you published this book. What year did this book first publish?
2005. I was 67 when it was published. People had not paid much attention to a lot of articles. I was just working steadily and doing, looking at what happened and why. And then when it was all put together, uh, say at least the academics to begin with, I just said, well, he's right. And I've written a lot since then, of course, but uh, uh, I
And in
think
fact,
that
your follow up book is Parking and the City. And in this book, you go in and you tell a lot of the success stories and a lot of the learnings that took place since the publication of The High Cost of Free Parking back in 2005.
yes, there were a lot of interesting things that people had written, and so I was the editor of that book, and I invited people to write. Say, for example. Um, in Albany, New York, they had a typical arrangement. You probably have it where you live. That if you have meters, where do you live?
I'm in Austin, Texas, as a matter of fact.
Oh, really? Well, Austin is now the biggest city that has removed all its parking requirements. Uh, but when they have parking meters, it's typical to have a 2 hour meter, and you say maybe $1 an hour. And then after 2 hours, you have to leave, or that when parking meters were invented, they were bitterly opposed by people. They said it's like an infernal combination of an alarm clock and a slot machine, because you put your money in and hope you get back before your time runs out. Well, what Albany did, and a few other cities have done, they do still charge $1 an hour for the first 2 hours, but then the third hour is $2 an hour, and the fourth hour is $4 an hour. So you can stay longer if you want, but you'll be paying more. So it still creates the incentive for turnover, but there's no penalty. You decide. And when they started that, most people still left before 2 hours, but some people stayed on. So it's much more flexible, and it brings in more money, because some people, they get held up or they forget, or whatever the reason is, they don't come back within 2 hours. So I can't remember how many chapters there were, 30 or 40 chapters, but there are a lot of small things like that. And I think there are other simple things that I don't think Austin does this when we're having progressive parking prices, but there are also progressive parking fines that some cities, for the first time you're parked without paying, you get a ticket that's a warning, and it says that you haven't paid, and this is a warning, and the next ticket will be $40.
Right.
And then the third ticket is $60. The next one after that is $80. So for people who occasionally make a mistake and don't get back in time, they just get a warning. But if you're a serial violator, it'll be very expensive. And I think this is important because some people think that parking tickets are just a cost of doing business. Because as you know, that many times you've overstayed, you come back and you don't have a ticket. That the tickets, you seem to get tickets often, but in many cities that only about 5% of violations get ticketed. And some people realize that, and they think it's not worth paying because you're unlikely that you'll be ticketed. But now people, the serial violators, will realize that's not a good idea.
Right, right, and that brings us back to your chapter that you have here, and what you're really talking about is making sure that we get these three reforms, and that's what you mentioned here. You channel this and say that the three things that we kind of need to do sort of at this big level, and then you can dive in and do more fine tuning later. Is number one, remove off-street parking requirements. You just mentioned that as well. Number two, charge the right price for that on-street parking. And then the third thing, and this is a really, really important thing, and I loved your example of right there in Southern California, Pasadena. I used to work right on Colorado there in downtown Pasadena. Is then that third thing is you take that money that is collected and you put it to work right there in that neighborhood.
Yes, well, nobody wants to pay for curb parking. And Pasadena was the best example, but Austin has many good examples as well. But in Pasadena, it was one of the grandest shopping areas in the United States in the 1920s. That rich people from the Midwest would come to spend the winter in Southern California, and Pasadena was one of the nicest places to stay. And they were, and then they made a big mistake in 1929. Could you think of the worst mistake you could make in transportation in 1929? Is that on Colorado Boulevard, they widened the street 14 feet on each side to put a light rail line down the center, a trolley car. Just as cars were displacing all of the street railways, they installed one on Colorado Boulevard. So they had to move the facades back by 14 feet on each side. And in 1929, so some of them just demolished the first of the 14 feet and put on a new facade. Others did a wonderful example of historic preservation. They took 14 feet out of the middle of the building and moved the front back. So it is a perfect example of the very best commercial architecture in 1929. And I don't think you'll find a better year for street facades than that. But then the Depression came along, and then the World War II, and after that, everybody had cars. There wasn't any parking in old Pasadena. So it decayed for decades. They were wonderful buildings in terrible condition.
Right.
Uh, and then the city wanted to put in parking meters because there were just 2 hour limits, and the merchants and their employees parked at the curb and moved their cars every 2 hours and complained to the city that there was no parking for their customers. So the city wanted to put in meters, and the merchants and the landowners said, well, no way. Drive out the few customers we have. And many of the buildings were vacant on the ground floor. So the mayor, Rick Cole, who is yes, Mayor Rick Cole, he went into a meeting and he just spontaneously said, if we put in the parking meters, we'll spend all the meter money to rebuild your sidewalks, put in street trees, historic street furniture, and clean up the alleys. And the merchants and everybody said, well, why didn't you tell us that? Let's run the meters till midnight. Let's run them on Sunday. Let's charge a high price. And the only difference was if we put in the parking meters, you get the money, not individually, but the neighborhood, the commercial neighborhood got the money. And so you could borrow money against meter revenue. So they borrowed $5 million and they completely redid all the public facilities.
Wow.
They,
What year was that, Don?
1982, I think.
Okay,
Yes,
1982.
1982.
Okay, so that predates when I was working there, because I was actually working in Pasadena on Colorado Boulevard in 1991.
Oh, and
And
it had revived by then. Yes, that it many people say, "Oh, the parking meters will kill our businesses," but the sales tax revenue, which is a measure of business activity, tripled in the next 5 years. If you put in parking meters that got turnover and the spaces were for the customers, then once the city had done what only the city could do, which is fix up all the public facilities, then the property owners had an incentive to restore their buildings. It's expensive to restore a historic building, but the rents then allowed historic preservation, and now it's one of the most successful places to visit in Southern California. 30,000 people on an average weekend come just to walk around in a place that some of my students have said their parents would not let them get off the bus on Colorado Boulevard because it was
Yeah.
such a slow.
Well, and I will say this, in the early 1990s, it was nowhere near as nice as it is now.
I'm
It's
sorry,
much nicer.
it was in 1992 that it happened. That's right. You were about the time that it wasn't a glamorous place in
It
1992,
wasn't.
was it? No,
No, not
but
at all. Yeah.
have you been back?
Yes, I was just going to say I've been back, and it's a delightful place now compared to what it was like in the early 1990s when I was there. Yeah.
That yeah, that's exactly it. It happened very quickly. So I think the revenue, getting back to where we started, the revenue return is the key
Right.
to charging the right price for curb parking. If the city wants to keep it for the general fund, nobody's interested in it. But if they know that the money will go to spend for public services on the metered blocks, they'll say, "We want that." And now there are four parking benefit districts in Pasadena. What had been, when you were there, was South Lake Avenue was the glamorous area, and then South Lake Avenue said, "Can we have parking meters?"
Right. Right. Yeah. Now you mentioned Mayor Rick Cole, not the same Rick Cole who's now the city council member.
Yes, that's right. Rick
Wow.
Cole had a great career spreading these ideas. He was the mayor in 1992,
I
and
had
then
no clue he had that background. Yeah.
he then became the city manager of, I think, Azusa, and then he became the city manager of Ventura, California, about 30 or 40 miles north of Los Angeles on the coast, and he introduced parking benefit districts there. The Ventura had tried parking meters in the 1950s, and the people rebelled so much they had a recall of the city council, a vote to recall them, and any who had voted for the parking meters were booted off the city council. So it was in the DNA of Ventura that we can't have parking meters. But when Rick Cole became the city manager there, he brought in the idea of a parking benefit district, which works very well.
And of course, I know Rick because he took over and was at the helm of CNU for a short period of time, coming out of the pandemic and our first gathering in 2021, which was one of those hybrid gatherings. I think it was 2021, and he was at the helm there for a short period of time, and now he's once again in politics there in city council. He just was voted in, and he's on city council there in Pasadena once again. So he's come home. That's great.
Yes, well, but Austin has some very good examples as well. In fact,
Yes.
Austin was one of the first parking benefit districts that was established after the book came out.
Mm-hmm.
There was a young woman. She had been a master's student at the University of Texas in Austin, and she read the book, or maybe it was fine, not the whole book. Who wants to read 752 pages? But enough of it
I did.
to become addicted. And She, just as a recent graduate of the University of Texas, she applied to the State Environmental Protection Agency and to get a grant to set up a parking benefit district right next to the University of Texas. And they gave it to her and set it up. And they repaired sidewalks in the neighborhood, sort of a student area west of the campus. But they did beautiful work on rebuilding the sidewalks, which had been, some of the streets didn't even have sidewalk on the full length of the street. It was the oddest looking thing. So they did wonderful things, and then they has 3 or 4 more parking benefit districts in Austin.
Yeah, yeah. And this particular organization, the Parking Reform Network, also in the wake of the success of your book and you barnstorming around the world talking about parking and talking about the need for parking reforms, this organization launched. What year did the PRN get started?
Oh, I think it was about 3 years ago.
Okay, so about 3 years ago, and what's really great, Tony Jordan is part of this organization, really heading this up, is that they are really kind of keeping tabs on the plethora of places that are now getting on board. You mentioned Austin, Texas a couple of times. Yes, in terms of the parking benefit districts, that was years ago that was set up. But then just recently, as you mentioned, we did see City Council move forward with more meaningful parking reforms that are in. You mentioned that we're in the largest cities in the nation. We are the 10th largest city from a population perspective in the nation right now, and so it was very, very encouraging to see City Council, move forward with some of these meaningful parking reforms. We have plenty of other land use stuff that we need to address because it goes hand in hand, the parking reforms and also the land use code reforms that need to take place. Talk a little bit about the Parking Reform Network and the role that they're serving in helping promote and keep your work, the legacy of what you have done and dedicated your career, how these guys are helping to push this forward and keep it on the forefront of people's minds.
Well, the president is Tony Jordan, who is a bundle of energy, and he became what they call a Shoupista for a long time ago, and he was born in Wilmington, in Los Angeles, but next to Long Beach, and he had moved to Portland, Oregon, but he came back to on Thanksgiving every year, and he called and he said, "Well, can we meet?" And so we had been meeting the week before Thanksgiving for maybe 10 years. But he was so engaged in parking reforms. It was incredible to me. He was so enthusiastic, but he wanted to create an organization to help people like him get together to cooperate. So he established the Parking Reform Network. Other people, not just around the U.S. but around the world, who somehow they have this enthusiasm for parking, which is, of course, is a fringe a fringe group and you don't know many other people who are as interested in parking as you are. But he put these people in contact with each other, and they has one of the wonderful things they do is he has a great map showing all the cities that have removed all their parking requirements or parking requirements in part of the city. So when people in Connecticut are interested in parking reform, they get in touch with the Parking Reform Network. And it's a way to, it's not like a communist party or anything like that, but it's
Right.
like a party.
Yeah.
That's right. It's like a party that of the political sense. It's that, and I think that if you're in Austin and you, well, and you want to get in touch with everybody else in Austin who is interested in parking reform, you join the Parking Reform Network, and they have this wonderful map. That one shows all the cities that removed all their parking requirements. Many more cities have removed parking requirements downtown or in part of town. But I think there was a town in Texas, maybe 60 miles east of Austin. Is there a town called Bastrop or something like that?
Yeah. It's like within an hour's drive from here. Yeah, Bastrop. Yeah.
That was one of the first cities in the country to remove its off-street parking requirements. So if you want to get in contact with like-minded people, this is the way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. And you mentioned something there too that I think is really, really important, is that, it kind of seems fringe. It kind of seems like, oh, these crazy people that are thinking about parking all the time. I think the best way for us to really get our hands around and understand how, especially off-street parking, how pervasive it is and how we let it get away, is looking at some photographs and some images. And you sent along a couple of really powerful images that I'd like for us to kind of zoom in on and take a look at, because I think that a picture really does tell 1,000 words. And when we zoom in on this image right here and we see the dramatic difference that happens in a space from just 2 years, 2020 to 2022. Tell us more about this particular series of images that you sent along for us.
Well, many people say that when you're talking about park reform, say, well, we're not Amsterdam. Well, neither was Amsterdam until recently. That was the first city I ever visited in Europe in 1962, and there were cars everywhere like this. After World War II, the country began to thrive, and they could buy cars, and then, of course they needed parking, so they were parking on the streets, and squares were filled up with cars. Historic squares that were for people became parking lots. And it was very hard at the beginning to say, well, no, we're not going to allow you to park here. But once they began to clear out the squares and have wonderful downtown places for people, then they began taking away more curb parking. And the picture you just showed, well, we're not allowing any parking on the street. And with this one, what is this? Is this Atlanta?
This is the Atlanta one, where you see the image above is of course the old Atlanta grid, and then the image below is, well, now we have plenty of parking.
Yes, it's just tragic what we have done. We've lost so many wonderful buildings, because if every new building has to have say maybe 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet, who knows what the right number is? The planners have no idea, especially because the curb parking is free. That it's all jammed up, and it looks we have a parking shortage. Everybody thinks about a parking shortage. Um, rather than a mispricing of the parking that we have. So if you want to build anything new, it has to have plenty of off-street parking. Old buildings don't last forever, but if you want to, are there any older buildings left in that down?
Boy, it sure doesn't look like it. Yeah, and I mean that's one of the huge tragedies, right?
See the one that is blue.
The one in blue, yeah, he did identify the one in blue.
So suppose that if you own the building and you want to change the use or maybe expand it, you have to demolish nearby buildings.
Yeah.
Because we're not going to let you open a new building unless it has plenty of off-street parking. So, but I think these things happen so slowly. Say, 100 years difference, something like that. But but there's creeping normalcy. It's the thing. Something happens gradually, like the temperature increases very slowly. You don't notice it. And I don't think that people in Atlanta realized what was happening.
Yeah. And you alluded to that, just there, you had said, who knows what the right number of parking spots is, if there really is even a right number. And you talk about this in that chapter that you have put together for the Doctrines, is that it's a pseudoscience. And what I find fascinating about your book, of course, was published by
the American Planning Association. Yeah, it's like a book was published or authored by a Catholic bishop, and it was blessed by the Pope, and saying that this is terrible, that we made a huge mistakes, and yet nothing much happened for a long time.
But it is happening now, which is really super, super encouraging to see. When you reflect back, and we talked about this a little bit in 2020, but it's good for us to talk about it again now here at the end of 2024 and going into 2025. When you look back and you see this momentum that has been gathering and is now getting up to speed, it's got to be very, very gratifying for you. Are you surprised at all, or what are some of the thoughts that you have based on the momentum that you're now seeing with this parking reform movement?
Well, I thought things would happen much faster. That the odd thing is that it took much longer to happen than I thought it would, but it's now happening much faster than I thought it could.
Okay.
So that is a surprise. And other people have asked me, how what do you think about this? And I think, how did it happen? And I think it's because of perseverance and longevity. I think if I didn't have both of those, then I wouldn't have seen much happening.
Yeah. I mean, we have a couple of images here on screen of Hope, the poster with former President Barack Obama, and an image of you, Hope, Shoup, Hope for parking reform. Yeah, it's been gratifying for me in the past decade or so that I've been really diving deeply into this. I guess it's more than a decade now, getting closer to 15 years now that I've been really diving deep into this urbanism side of the built environment and how it improves and helps shape our built environments to encourage more walking and biking. And so it's been so gratifying for me to see more and more cities embracing parking reform.
Yes, this image on the right was from one of your competing podcasts, the parking podcast. There are several podcasts that are dedicated only to parking.
Yeah. Well, and we're a fun group of urbanists that are out here, trying to spread the message. And one of the most important things that I talk about so frequently is how do we break out of our bubble of, people thinking about parking reform and built environment and urbanism and active transportation. And so, because it's so important for our ideas to permeate outside of our quote unquote urbanism and transportation bubbles and be able to permeate into the zeitgeist of the community at large. And whenever I see things like that happening, it just makes me smile. And I have to think that it's the same for you too.
Well, I think it's one of the big things that have helped cause the change is active towns and similar podcasts. That if there weren't any way to get in front of an audience, then I wouldn't have had much luck. But active towns is a wonderful source for people who are interested in cities and are open to new ideas.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And, one of the things that I've been trying to do, especially recently, because when you and I last spoke in 2020, this was an audio only podcast. And so, people were tuning in. I made the move over into video because I started to realize just how impactful and powerful it is to be able to get the visual message out there, and the audience is much greater and grander in many ways. Talk a little bit about some of your fond memories of some of the videos that you have been on and featured in. And I know you've got a subset of your website that is called Parkumentaries. And so I'm going to pull that up on screen here and let you riff on this concept of bringing the Shoupista messages and the Shoup dogma or doctrines out to the masses through video.
Well, I think YouTube is a big change for everybody, and just about anything you're interested in. Um, now, when you're on YouTube, it pops up on your television screen. That in YouTube, that I've seen podcasts that I'd forgotten about. That suddenly, obviously, YouTube sort of. It tries to figure out what you're interested in, and it feeds you those things. But I suppose maybe other people are interested in urban planning, and I might pop up on their television screen. So that was a big surprise.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and this one here, which is cycling right now, is Adam Ruins things, and I can't remember what year this was, but this is it had to be just a bunch of fun for you to be able to have this particular platform on True TV profile your work. How cool is this?
Yes, I confess I had not heard of Adam Conover until he asked me to be at his one of his shows, and I'd been to his podcasts as well. It was interesting that he asked me to record something for his podcast. So he wrote the script for me. And I didn't like it, so I said, "Well, I want to say something else." He let me do it, and he's certainly a big part of the urban sphere in everything he does. I think he's got a podcast on the radio. I think that, and I think somehow students pick up on this much more than if it's in a cartoon than if it's in a lecture.
Yeah. Yeah. What I find so endearing about that particular video that Adam put together for you and for the channel is how relatable that whole message was. That final scene, walking into the the car salesman lobby there and all of that. That's what I mean by trying to break outside of our bubble, is being able to get into, bring people along so that they can understand why parking reform is so necessary. And I mentioned earlier that, yes, I did read. I didn't really read your book. I listened to it on Audible. And it is very, very entertaining. And I think that is one of the nice things about the book that you wrote, is that you had to grab a hold of a lot of complex ideas, and there's numbers in there and everything, but you had a way of writing it which is incredibly approachable and quite entertaining as well. And I was noticing too when I was reading the doctrines chapter that you're putting forward for this upcoming book, is that I see a lot of human behavior and understanding of human behavior in this. Talk a little bit about that, and that'll probably be our final point. Is talking about how an understanding of human behavior has been so important and impactful in the work that you have done as we try to move forward into this next generation of and continuing the progress with parking reform.
Well, I'm not sure. I think that writing is the important thing. I try to be funny if I can. I did listen to a bit of the Audible. I can't imagine listening to it for 16 hours. But the thing that surprised me was that there are no tables or charts. It's just the language. And I think it comes across very well without looking at the statistics or the tables or anything like that. I couldn't believe it. But it seems to me that other people have said that they thought it was better than reading the book. It wasn't me reading the book. They hired a voice artist, I suppose. Um, I I suppose that it's been possible to write about parking so much uh, because everybody does it. That everybody knows what parking is like. And one of the many uh, proposals that I've made is called transit validation. That some athletic events that whenever you buy a ticket, say to the Chase Stadium in San Francisco, the tickets for athletic events, and they have concerts as well. I think there are 19,000 seats at the stadium, and they have 900 parking spaces. But whenever you buy a ticket, that ticket is a transit pass on the day of the event.
Right.
And it costs the stadium about $3 per ticket that they pay to the transit agency. And the transit agency knows that there are going to be people who want to ride to the stadium, and they get paid for every person who rides to the stadium. So they have nonstop buses from all around the area straight to the stadium and back. So people understand, well, this is better. I won't have to pay for parking at the stadium, and the off-street parking there is over $100 per event.
Right.
But they can ride free on transit, and they didn't have to build a lot of parking spaces. It opened just before the COVID came in, so if there are no events at the stadium, they're not paying anything. The stadium doesn't pay anything. Whereas if they had built a 10,000 parking spaces, they'd have a gigantic debt service to pay for. So I think that the things like this transit validation is important. And then you don't have to worry about traffic when you arrive or when you leave. I saw a study in Los Angeles said that 80% of people said they often leave an event early to avoid the parking jam.
Right.
Getting
Right.
out of a parking lot when at the same time everybody else is trying to get out of the parking lot is a nightmare. So they miss the last part of an event, and then they regret that. But if you have transit validation in lieu of parking, it's something that I think is such an easy thing to do. And when it was published, people wrote to me from around the world saying, "Oh, we do this for everything." In Australia or New Zealand, they wouldn't have an event that didn't have transit validation. You knew that when you bought a ticket, you also have a parking pass. No, no, I mean a transit pass.
Right.
So
Right.
I
Right.
think
Transit pass.
that's the kind of thing. Have you heard of that in Austin? Do they do that in Austin?
I don't know if they do. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that irks me about like events, you're channeling the events, and I'm going to pull up a photo here that reminded me of what we were talking about before we hit the record button, which was sidewalks. And so we'll make this be our last thing, is talking about sidewalks. Los Angeles, of course, has been tapped to host three major events in the coming years: the Super Bowl coming up, and also the World Cup, and then the Olympics in 2028. And what irks me about some of the events, huge events that happen here in Austin, is some of them are very conducive to being able to use transit and walking and biking, anything other than a personal and private automobile. The events that I'm thinking of are like ACL, the big, huge music festival, which happens just walking distance from my house here in the Zilker Park neighborhood. And then South by Southwest, where you have lots of the events happening in the downtown area. Again, very accessible by walking, biking, and transit. And really having a car and trying to drive to these events in a car is quite inconvenient. But then and so I look at that as being, these are wonderful events that are strategically located in venues and areas that make sense. The one that irks me so much is when like an artist, a musician will play at one of the far out venues where the only way that it's really feasible to get there is to drive a personal automobile out to this event. And it's just like, I'm irked by the artist choosing to play out at that venue when there's some close-in venues that would have been walkable and bikeable. And I've gotten to the point where I haven't gone to go see an artist that I'd like to see because I don't want to drive. I just don't want to be in that. I would prefer to have that artist play in a close-in venue where I can ride my bike to. I mean, that's kind of where I'm at on that. I'm not sure how that addresses exactly what you were talking about, but that's when you mentioned events, and that certainly sparked something in me. Speaking of sparking something in me, I did want to sort of close this out by talking a little bit about Los Angeles. There's sidewalks, the challenge that the city has had for decades. The consent decree that took place in 2015 for them to address the fact that so many of their sidewalks are in disarray. And we have on screen here a beautiful image from Alyssa Walker's new newsletter, Torched. And this was published a few weeks ago about LA has a plan, and LA Mayor Karen Bass basically doing an executive director for the city to do a better job with their CIP planning, their capital improvement plan, and actually putting that and doing planning in advance, and the challenge that is sidewalks. I know you're passionate about this as well, Don, so why don't you close us out by talking a little bit about LA's huge sidewalks challenge.
Well, LA is known as the city of broken dreams. People come to make it big, and they have to prostitute themselves in every way, and it's very, very unlikely that they'll make it. But it's also the city of broken sidewalks. That in 1972, the city got a grant from the federal government during a recession to repair broken sidewalks, and the city very unwisely changed its code, saying that previously the property owners are responsible for maintaining the sidewalks in front of their property. The city said, we will pay for any sidewalk repairs. Of course, that would be politically very popular. Say, we're going to pay for the sidewalk repair. Well, where would the money come from? Well, it came from the federal government for 3 years, and then that dried up. And then Proposition 13, which is our property tax limit, was passed in 1978, and there was no money to pay for sidewalks. And they decayed for the next 40 years. Very slowly, it's a creeping normalcy that slowly they began lifted until now. It was in 1950, there were 4,000 miles of broken sidewalks. That's about 40% of all the sidewalks were broken, meaning that they didn't meet the Americans with Disabilities Act policy, that it has to be usable by somebody who's in a wheelchair or in a walker or whatever. but it happens so slowly. Everybody thought, well, this is normal. And finally, they lost a lawsuit, and were committed to spend almost $1.5 billion to fix the sidewalks, which we don't have. But they said it would take over 30 years. And the city controller, who's sort of like an auditor, did an audit of the first few years, and they had fixed 1% of the sidewalks. So I have a different policy to fix the sidewalks before the Olympics. Is that we have already removed that promise that the city will pay for the sidewalks, but the homeowners don't want to pay, because sometimes, say for something like that sidewalk you could see in the picture, would have all been broken up. They had to take it all out and put in a new sidewalk, which is expensive, and many people don't have the money.
Right.
So my proposal is called pay on exit finance, is that the city would repair all the sidewalks now. The sidewalk repairers like to do it they have economies of scale. They want to do a large amount of sidewalks, and not just one little patch here and one little patch there. They want to do a lot of work at the same time, because they have a lot of heavy equipment and they have to have the staff. And so I think the city should and I've talked to contractors, they could easily fix all the sidewalks in the next 2 or 3 years. But where is the money to come from? So I have proposed that pay on exit finance, that people will be assessed the value of the cost of the repairs, but they can delay the cost until they sell their property.
Right.
And they have to pay interest on it. So it's sort of like the opposite of a conventional savings account at a bank. You put money in and you get interest on your principal. So the other side of that is that you borrow the money and you pay interest until you are willing to pay for what you owe, but you have to pay when you sell your property. And the median sales price of a single family house in Los Angeles is $1.1 million. So you can't say we don't have the money to fix the sidewalk in front of our house. It said, we're not going to make you pay now, but you can pay now. But if you don't pay now, you could delay it as long as you want until you sell the property, and then you have to pay it with interest. So I think it would be humiliating for Los Angeles to have people from around the world come, and right across the street from the Olympic Village at UCLA, all the sidewalks are broken in the neighborhood. That it would be just a catastrophic black eye for people to come to Los Angeles and see right around the venues of the Olympic Village that the sidewalks are inaccessible. They violate the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think that fortunate the things have gotten so bad, just like that map of Atlanta, showing how bad our policies have turned out, that we can change it. We can remove off-street parking requirements, and we can fix sidewalks. And I think that this would be investing in the infrastructure of Los Angeles. It'll make the city walkable. We won't be the city of broken sidewalks, which we will be if we don't fix them. I think that it won't be just Los Angeles looks bad during the Olympics. The whole United States looks bad. If any pictures, the pictures will not now. You could hardly find a sidewalk in Los Angeles that looks like the picture you had. I think after we finish, I'll send you some pictures of the catastrophically broken sidewalks. And during the first 4 years when they were fixing sidewalks, they spent $31 million a year to fix sidewalks, and they spent over $35 million a year settling trip and fall lawsuits, because they're awful. People break hips, elbows, risks falling on sidewalks, and the city has to pay sometimes more than $1 million because people are crippled for life by falling on a sidewalk. And I think that this policy, if if the city really does adopt it, can be spread around the world. Is that we have a lot of not just sidewalks but public infrastructure that when people sell their property, then they pay for the public investment.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's a really good point, Don. And one of the things that I like to, sort of emphasize too is that as we look towards these games and these major events, I think you're absolutely right. I think would be a black eye. And I'm going to pull up the landing page to our first conversation here once again. And I love that you had this photo from Paris of you on one of the bike share bikes. The vision and the aspirations of the city, of the Olympic Committee, is for this to be a car-free Olympics. I was very blunt in saying it won't be. It's not going to be a car-free. It's not going to be a motor vehicle-free Olympics. We have an opportunity, just like we did in 1984, to really leverage the power of buses and being able to shuttle many, many people. But the thing that I always try to emphasize from an active towns perspective is that every single transit ride begins and ends with some form of active mobility trip, whether that's on a bike, like a bike share bike, or walking. And so to your point, absolutely huge black eye if we don't have safe and inviting walking and biking facilities for people to be able to get to their meaningful destinations, to and from transit, to the venues. And this is the legacy that we have the opportunity to transform that built environment in Los Angeles, which, by the way, is a very walkable and bikeable environment pretty much all year round from the weather perspective. There's no excuses here. We do have that opportunity. And I think that this is a great opportunity to try to leverage that. I love the creativity of your financing solution. I'm sure there's many others. I'm always irked by the fact that, cities will say, oh yeah, our pockets are empty. We don't have any money left for people walking and biking. And yet mysteriously, they always have money for major roadway projects for cars.
Yes, I think so. I think that transit validation is the way to go for the Olympics, but we don't have it for anything now. See, I think we have to learn how to include transit fare in the price of a ticket for everything. We can't just have in 2028 say, oh, well, we ought to have a car-free Olympics. We're saying that now, but why don't we have transit validation now? Why don't we fix our sidewalks? So I think that, I guess, some people have asked how I've had any success, and I think it is, as I said, perseverance and longevity. And I think if I live long enough for the Olympics, I think that things are so bad now with traffic congestion and broken sidewalks that maybe the Olympics will light a fire to help us reform.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly enough, Alyssa's most recent newsletter post was this: everyone was excited because the Olympics were coming. Now everybody is worried. So,
yeah.
Well, Don, I know that we could continue for many, many, many more hours, but I need to turn you loose and get you back to your day. This has been such an honor and pleasure catching up with you. Again, the original Shoup Dogg right here. Thank you so much, Professor Donald Shoup. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Hey, thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode with the Shoup Dogg. And if you did, please, hey, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and share it with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, be honored to have you subscribe to the channel. Just click on that subscription button down below and ring that notifications bell. And if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. It's easy to do. Just navigate over to activetowns.org and click on the support tab at the top of the page. Reminder, patrons patrons do get early and ad-free access to all my video content, and every little bit helps and is very much appreciated. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in, and until next time, this is John signing off by wishing you much activity, health, and happiness. Cheers.
And again, sending a huge thank you out to all my Active Towns ambassadors supporting the channel on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, YouTube Super Thanks, as well as making contributions to the nonprofit. Every little bit adds up and it's much appreciated. Thank you all so much.